Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Project Management Podcast. We are coming to you live from Orlando, Florida. We are here at the Disney Resort at the 2015 PMI Global Congress. And with me, almost like at every Congress, it seems, is Frank Parth. Hello, Frank.
Hello, Cornelius. Good to see you again.
Same here, same here. It seems like we meet here at these places once a year.
Well, we don't go to the chapter meetings anymore because both of us are traveling all the time.
We're on the road so much. So your presentation is about successful projects and the fact that they depend on the business, but we're going to start somewhere completely different. We're nearing the end of 2015. What do you see ahead of us in 2016 for project management? What are the big trends coming?
Cornelius, when we look back at project management over the last 10, 20, 30 years, PMI and other organizations have done an extremely good job setting out the processes that we have to follow, the methodologies, the tools, the techniques, and all this. So we have a very well-defined approach to project management, but projects are still failing. The Standish Group's Chaos Project, where they survey IT projects in North America since 1995, shows a very poor success rate for IT projects. Ed Merrow, in his book Industrial Mega Projects, looks at these large multi-billion-dollar oil and gas processing projects, and he says 78% of them fail by his criteria. So with all the methodologies we have, we're still failing projects much too often. I think what has to happen, and I think where PMI is heading in the direction with the new standards and certifications and everything, is the project managers have to get involved much earlier in the project selection process, laying out the project, and even before we start officially approving the project, they have to get involved in the decision-making process. In fact, a lot of my talk this afternoon is about that, and we're seeing PMI saying no. The feedback we're getting from our corporate executive council is that project managers have to understand the strategy of the organization, they have to have strong leadership qualities, they have to take on a much more inclusive role than just managing schedule and identifying risks and the more typical things we've been concentrating on in the past. Well, I think that's the direction we're all going.
All right. So your talk, Successful Projects Depend on the Business, is going to be this afternoon. What interests you in this topic? Why did you choose this topic?
I chose this topic strictly because, in my experience, and I won't admit to more than 30 years, even though I have quite a bit more than that, so many of the successful projects and the unsuccessful ones are controlled outside the project itself. Project managers never have all the authority that they need to do the work. They have the responsibility, but not the authority. The business people keep changing their mind on what they want. Oh, I don't like the way that web page looks. I'd rather have it look this way. All these continual changes impact the project. Or when we're talking about the large, complex engineering and construction projects, the external economic environment has a huge impact on that. And I'll give examples of that in my talk this afternoon. But there is so much that makes a project successful that is completely outside the project manager's control. Much of it is in the control of the business itself. So what we need to do is do a better job educating the business leaders, the senior executives, that this is what we have to do to make projects successful. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they're likely to make decisions that totally impact the project without understanding the impacts, the long-term impacts of that. What got me interested in this was several years ago, I did the risk analysis for an Aramco refinery. This was planned as a $9.6 billion project. I was there with a small team for about 4 days, and I get back to Aramco headquarters and said, "You're not going to make it." They said, "You don't know that. You just got here." And I said, "Yes, I can." And I laid out reasons. And the reasons were all good business decisions. They were trying to save money. And so they did things that had a huge impact on the project. The project finally ended up 40% over budget and 9 months late. And it was for the reasons I predicted. So they make these decisions without understanding what the impacts are.
Right. And I think that's also, I've read your paper, that is also the main problem that you are seeing today, right? Big decisions are made early on with very little data on projects. Did I translate that correctly?
You did indeed, yes. Decisions are made actually before the projects even start that have a huge impact on it. I look at some of the research that's done by college professors like Ben Flyvberg at the University of Oxford in London now. He's a political scientist, but he looks at large, complex infrastructure projects and says, okay, these are the reasons they fail. And they have very little to do with the technology or the project management itself. There's other research going on where we're saying that, okay, the business decisions are where the greatest value of the project is corrected. Hutchinson and Wabecki did this research back 10, 12 years ago. And most of the value created in the project is done by the business before the project managers or the engineers ever get involved. And they came to the conclusion, they don't phrase it this way, but they came to the conclusion that it's better to manage the right project poorly than the wrong project perfectly. You get much more value out of the right project.
Right. Your paper and your presentation looks at 4 areas: business environment, current research, approaches to assessing the adequacy of the early planning, and then finally proposed development stages for programs. So we're going to take a look at all 4 of these. The business environment, what are we seeing here?
What we're seeing is a rapidly changing business environment. Now, where I particularly got interested in was the oil and gas environment because of the huge fluctuations in oil prices, raw commodities prices. The mining, the minerals environment is exactly the same way. Commodities prices fluctuate wildly. So how does the business know when to start a project? And that turns out to have a huge amount of uncertainty in it. As project managers, we deal with much less uncertainty than the business does because we're in a fixed environment once we start the project, but the outside environment can change radically, and that has a huge impact on which decisions we make and when. It should take 6 to 8 years to build a complex oil refinery. And the example I give in the paper is there was one done by the Essar Corporation in India. It took them 13 years to build a refinery, more than twice what it should have. But they did it in a period of time where oil prices rose rapidly between the start of the project and the completion of the project. They made a ton of money on it. If they had managed the project well, they would have lost money on it because the oil prices had not changed very much. So the external environment can have this impact on the project, and we can't
Can make or break
that.
the project.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Absolutely. And so when the project managers, in my approach, they need to get involved much earlier so that they pay attention to what the economic environment is. They can identify early warning signals that might impact the project and then be able to deal with them much earlier than waiting till the end of the project and saying, oh dear.
Requires a much greater understanding of the business and the environment from us project managers, which almost brings us to the new PMI talent triangle, where business is a part of it.
Exactly. And I was glad to see PMI make these changes because that's really what needs to happen. The project managers need to get more involved earlier and have a better understanding of the entire environment, just as senior executives in an organization need to have a much better understanding of project management, so when they make a decision, they can see the impacts of that.
Right. The second area that you have in the paper is current research. What have you found?
There's a lot of academic research in this. I mentioned Ben Flyvberg, who won an award at the Congress last night for one of his papers in terms of research on public infrastructure projects.
Yes.
And what he points out very clearly is that they almost all go over budget and never deliver the promises, the benefits that they were promised. And he goes into specific reasons for that. For example, if I'm going to, in California, for example, last year, September of 2013, we opened a brand new bridge between Oakland and near San Francisco, Buena Vista Island near San Francisco. The promises were this was going to be a fantastic bridge, it would have a lot of traffic and everything else. When public sector people, when the politicians, when the government agencies look at these, they don't have the internal capability to judge the cost and the benefits, so they hire consultants to do that. California Department of Transportation said, well, we can figure out how much this bridge costs. So they budgeted $780 million for it. When they laid out the RFP, they got exactly one bid back for $1.6 billion. More than twice what they had internally budgeted. The bridge finally ended up at well over $6 billion.
Wow.
And what Flyvberg shows is that we hire consultants, governments hire external consultants to give them the costs and give them the benefits. Look at how we hire consultants. We don't hire consultants that tell us, you're not going to do any good with this. We hire the consultants that gave us the greatest benefits. So the benefits are overpromised to start with. And then politicians always look good when they promise great benefits to these expensive projects. They'll never get the projects approved if they can't show huge benefits for it. So the whole decision process leads us to poor results when the projects are finally done. And let's see, who else? Hutchinson did some research. He gave a presentation to, it was an oil company in Japan. I'm trying to remember struggling with the name right now. And what he showed, again, was that the benefits are created when the project is first defined, or even before that, not during the actual execution phase of the project. Other research done by Wabecki was funded by PMI, and what he showed, no, Klageck. What he looked for was early warning signs of these huge projects. Can we tell when they're starting to head into trouble? So he defines these huge projects, as do Hutchinson, Wabecki, and some of the other people. They categorize programs into 5 specific stages, and they look at the benefits and how each stage is managed. And unfortunately, even though PMI funded the research that Klageck did, he found no way to identify early problems. So looked at early warning signs, he said they don't exist. There's too much uncertainty, too much noise in the information.
Interesting. All right, so much for the current research. The third area you have is approaches to assessing the adequacy of the early planning. What do you mean by that? Let's start with that before we go into the actual approaches.
You know, as project managers, we do our risk identification, we lay out our KPIs and define our progress metrics and everything else. How do we do that for the business? Because so much of the business so much of the success on the project is dependent on these early decisions. How do we judge whether those are adequate or not? The Construction Industry Institute has developed what they call the PDRI, the Project Definition Rating Index. Mm-hmm. And it's a series of questions, some for construction, some for industrial projects, that are designed to drive out what the risks area are on the project. Mm-hmm. And all the questions are weighted based on feedback from actual projects. The heaviest weighted questions are the very first few, and they're all on the business. Have you really thought about the goals for this facility that you're building? Are there other ways to do this? Do you have a good business plan that's been approved? Have you looked at the economic environment? These have huge weights on whether the project is successful or not. There are later questions on the engineering approach and the project management approach, and those are important, but they have much less weight.
And oftentimes we, the project managers, we're not part of these early decisions.
We are not part of these early decisions, no.
Would it then behoove us, once we get on the project, that we revisit that and make sure that the decisions were actually sound?
It would behoove us to get in. It would actually be better for us
if we were involved.
If we were involved, because after these have all been approved, it's a little bit too late to figure out why, because you're not going to have much influence over the business decisions at that point. It's better to get involved earlier. And the PDR is repeated at least 3 times as the project develops, and the score should improve each time. So the more development you do, the more planning, the more analysis, the better your numbers should get. Similar to the PDRI, but it starts even earlier, is an approach that was promulgated by Independent Project Analysis Incorporated, IPA. And that's the company that Ed Merrill heads up. And their decades of research on large, complex projects are what led to his book, Industrial Mega Projects, where he talks about what makes these projects successful. And it's a similar series of questions. Now, they concentrate on large processing plants, like oil and gas processing plants. But again, it's a series of questions, and you do it 3 times, and it's designed to drive out how well have you really thought about what this project is for you? Does it benefit the company? Have you thought about the details? And he has a specific series of questions that he asks. So the first time is all in the business. The second time you do this FEL processing, front-end loading processing, is a combination of business and engineering. And then the third time you do it, it's all engineering and project management. And again, the numbers should improve each time. At the end of each time you do this, there's a gate. And you do not move past that gate until you've satisfied specific criteria for the previous one. Mm-hmm. So 2 different approaches, similar in style. They kind of overlap to a little bit. But again, the goal here is to drive out how risky is this project, how likely you are to be successful, depending on the business decisions that were made early on.
Right. And I can now also see much better why the 4th area is in your paper, proposed development stages for programs, because since all these decisions are so early on, programs have a better chance to help make these decisions early on. The program manager, the program officers, they can help versus us project managers who come on, not front-loaded, but back-loaded. It's all over by then. All right?
Exactly.
So fourth and final area you looked at, proposed development stages for programs.
Based on all this research, and it's not just the academics that are looking at this, Cornelius. I've worked with Anglo-American Mining, I've worked with Chevron, and they also have very similar approaches designed to identify the early stages that are most risky on the project. And so private industry is looking at this as well as, the more studious people. And there seems to be a general consensus growing that we have to change the approach to project management. Don't give up the methodologies we have right now. Don't give up the processes we have right now, but start much earlier and get involved. When you start a new complex project, don't think of it as a project. Think of it like starting up a new business. What's the business case? What's your whole approach to organizing? Much more than just building the project organization, the business has to be involved in that also. So that's part of it. Another thing that we don't do is we do good risk analysis. As Dr. David Hilson likes to say, understanding what the risks are in the project does not tell you how risky the project is.
Yes.
Because there's so many external risks that we simply don't identify and that can hugely impact the project. Another approach is our whole approach to contracting. If we're talking about a project that's 2, 3, 8 years long, we tend to lock people in with firm fixed price contracts, the construction companies, the engineering companies. Every year, KPMG does research on large construction projects around the world. And in 2010, we passed 50% of all large construction projects were now firm fixed price contracts. But think about that. We're locking in decisions years from now when the future is so uncertain. A much better approach is use a firm fixed price contract when you're talking about the engineering part of it, because that's well defined. That's not impacted by the environment quite so much. But on the construction site, when you've got 4 or 5 years worth of construction, there's a huge impact based on economic conditions, labor relations, suppliers, all sorts of things impact then. A cost plus contract is a much better form of contracting, and it ends up being much cheaper than a firm fixed price contract. When you give a contractor a firm fixed price contract, you're incentivizing them to do two things. One is to do the work as cheaply as possible. And secondly, you're incentivizing them to hand in claims as often as possible. And the construction industry sees more claims on firm fixed price contract than any other type of contract, because a contractor is trying hard to make as much money as they can for themselves. Yeah. And when the external environment changes, that opens up the door for them to say, hand in claims.
Things have changed. We need more money here.
Sure.
All right. I think we've already moved into the final question that I had for you, and that's recommendations of what we need to do better. We've already talked about the change of the procurement process and also the increased risk management. What other recommendations do you have in general, and maybe also for our listeners who are project managers and who are now thinking, oh my, I'm getting into these projects way after the big decisions have been made?
Don't drink too much. That's my first one.
Or do drink too much once you
whatever
notice.
is appropriate. Yeah. Have a very supportive family, because that's going to help a lot. One thing I've seen in my work around the world, Cornelius, is that there's no standard definition of what a project manager is.
Okay.
What PMI says a project manager is not what I see in most companies around the world. To most companies, a project manager is a schedule keeper.
Oh,
and that's it. That's all they do. But let's face it, project management to be effective has to be so much more than that.
Yes.
I can't just keep the schedule if I don't control the resources. I can't keep the schedule if I don't control the budget and identify the risks also. So I think there has to be a much broader emphasis on this is what project management is, and it's much more than just laying out and developing the schedule.
All right.
So I think that's work for next year also.
Okay, wonderful. Frank, thank you very much. Successful projects depend on the business. Good luck with your presentation this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Cornelius. It's always a pleasure to talk to you again.